This episode of the Internet History Podcast is sponsored by MetaLab. Their slogan is MetaLab, we make interfaces. For over a decade, MetaLab has helped some of the world's top companies and entrepreneurs build products that millions of people use every day. You probably didn't realize it at the time, but odds are you've used an app that they've helped design or build, like Slack or Facebook Messenger or Amazon's Cloud Drive application. MetaLab wants to help you take your idea and turn it into the next billion-dollar app. They're one of the few agencies in the world that can take a product idea from end to end, from napkin sketch to real shipped product. Learn more by going to metalab.co. That's metalab.co. My thanks to MetaLab for sponsoring the Internet History Podcast. Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. As you'll hear in this episode, I thought most people knew who Claude Shannon was. In the pantheon of cool people who made the modern information era, he's right up there. But maybe he has been a bit underappreciated. That's why I read with great delight the book, A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age. Today we're going to talk about Shannon's life with the authors of that biography, Jimmy Sony and Rob Goodman. Especially you software engineers out there, if you don't know who Claude Shannon is, get educated. You owe your livelihood to this man. Enjoy this conversation about the father of information theory with authors Jimmy Sony and Rob Goodman, and buy their book, A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age. There's a link in the show notes. Jimmy Sony, Rob Goodman, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thanks for having us. Thanks a lot.
We're going to talk about your great book, but we'll plug that at the end. We're actually here to talk about a great man, Claude Shannon. Mm-hmm. Let's do the simplest thing and begin at the beginning. He's of my wife's people, the Northern Michiganders. Mm-hmm. But also, actually, a way into this, I think, is, his childhood hero was Thomas Edison, and I feel like in the mid-20th century, this idea that the inventors and the tinkerers came from the Midwest was sort of like common, knowledge or whatever. And now everyone thinks that the smart people are on the coasts or whatever. But Shannon really comes, at least, based on my reading, from this tradition of the Midwestern tinkerer, inventor, sort of on the plains or whatever, like making their own gadgets to make life easier, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think there's no Claude Shannon there's none of Claude Shannon's achievements, I would hypothesize, would have happened had he not been born in a place whose primary purpose was the making of physical things. I like to think that if he grew up in Boston or New York, a more cosmopolitan place, he would have been exposed to a lot of ideas, but he wouldn't have had this very practical sense of engineering that he did. This is somebody who grew up, he made a barbed wire telephone network that he could communicate with a friend using Morse code. He and his friend also built a barnyard elevator in one of their friends' backyard so that they could use it to go up and down. They both survived. This was a town that was very practical. His dad was a lawyer, but he was also an undertaker, and he made caskets and he made furniture. So this was a place where there was just a lot of building going on, and Claude Shannon had an unusual interest in building. He also took some heart in the fact that his grandfather was an inventor and a tinkerer, from the Midwest, and he had built an improvement on the washing machine that was actually patented. It was the Shannon family's first patent. And he was a distant, relative of Thomas Edison, who he just admired and thought the world of. He would only find that out later, interestingly enough, but it was an important part of his personal history. So I do think that there's a way in which you take Claude Shannon out of the Midwest, and I'm not sure that you get any of the later achievements. And I think it was a big part of his identity.
Rob, what year specifically was he born?
1916.
16.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So right, the airplane's brand new, automobiles are brand new, and in Michigan, people sometimes call Detroit was the Silicon Valley of the early 20th century. So he is in this milieu of new technologies coming to the fore of everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just a part of his childhood, but it's a part of his undergraduate education as well. So when he goes off to the University of Michigan, which is just a really outstanding public institution, he is immediately plugged into an engineering community. This is in the early 30s. He's plugged into a community of an extremely well-funded engineering department that works on everything from labs testing naval ships and modeling hydrodynamics to early studies in the transmission of information, electricity, and also in his logical philosophical curriculum that he takes in some of his humanities classes to the basics of Boolean algebra, which of course he makes a tremendous amount of hay at MIT later on in his career. So the fact that he doesn't just have an upbringing that's structured around tinkering and playing with things and solving math puzzles, but is able to immediately plug into a community of engineers and like-minded people at an institution like the University of Michigan, where he's able to major in both math and engineering and bridge these two, bridge the more abstract discipline of math with the more hands-on discipline of engineering. That's sort of essential to who Claude Shannon is and the interests that he's going to combine for the rest of his career.
Right, because that's sort of the key part of the story is combining that mathematical mind with the mechanical mind and proving to the world that they're basically a unified way of looking at it. But so, all right, so you mentioned the 2 degrees at Michigan, electrical engineering and mathematics. Do you get a sense that he was closer to one or the other, or was it all the same to him, kind of like we're saying?
I think if you had to sort of gun to your head, you had to choose, it would probably be engineering. The engineers, even to this day, see Claude, the electrical engineers see him as their patron saint, their hero. He's looked a little bit askance from the mathematicians, and part of the reason is that in many of the papers that he published, they felt like they were insufficiently rigorous from a mathematical perspective, and he took a lot of heat from that. Now, the irony is later, when mathematicians go back and dot the I's and cross the T's, it turns out the steps that Claude Shannon may have appeared to skip over, he had just done in his head, right? So if you had to, you'd say he's probably more engineer than mathematician. However, the work he's doing is theoretically very rigorous. He's one of these folks who he probably could think about the 20th step and not really worry too much about sort of steps 1 to 19. And that again, it doesn't endear him to the mathematicians. He's much more of a practical, hard-headed engineering type. But ultimately, it was all part of this spirit of play. It was all part of this basic sense that he was out to solve puzzles and problems. And one of the things that we've heard from people who have read the book who are in engineering or computer science or math or related disciplines is that the book evokes for them this sort of sense that he was there to solve puzzles. And that puzzle could be, how do you build a robot to play chess? That puzzle could be, how do you transmit huge amounts of information? And that puzzle could be, how do you make a trumpet breathe fire? And for Claude Shannon, all of those things were equivalently, those were puzzles of equal interest.
Or roulette wheels, or the physics of juggling. Yeah. All right, so let's take him up to MIT and the differential analyzer. Maybe even describe what that was.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It's one of the things that we delved into in talking about Claude Shannon's earlier career was his work with analog computers. And it struck me before I knew much about the topic, what's an analog computer? Computers are supposed to be digital. Well, it turns out that before digital computers were a thing, there were tremendous machines that were the size of rooms. It looked like, in the pictures we saw of them preserved from the 1930s, of giant foosball tables, essentially, with shafts that would rotate laterally and gears that would interlock. And the idea was the machine would take input by reading a graph that you would trace with a stylus. And after the gears and the shafts would rotate a prescribed number of times, it would output on another pin that was attached to an unwinding spool of paper the answer, which was also in graphical form. So the way these analog computers would work is essentially by acting out the equations they were describing. And that's essentially what's their analog. Vannevar Bush, who was the mastermind of these analog computers at MIT and Claude Shannon's really important early mentor, said that they were analog in a real sense, in the idea that as long as they were acting on an equation, they were essentially acting as a miniature copy of the thing they were describing. So you could use an analog computer, for instance, to figure out the forces that would act on a bridge in a certain amount of wind speed, and how much wind speed could the bridge take before it would buckle and collapse. Well, the computer is actually acting out in a reduced way the bridge and the wind on it, the force of gravity and so on, and acting essentially as an analogy for what was happening to that bridge. This was a sort of pretty easy application, but as these computers got more sophisticated from the late 20s into the mid-30s, before they get replaced by digital computers, they were doing things like tracking the development of the solar system, tracking the forces acting on atomic nuclei, and also in something that really interested Claude Shannon, tracking the capacity of the nation's telephone and telegraph network, how much information could it transmit before it would overburden its capacity. So these are all the things that you can do with a computer that is acting out equations rather than representing them the way that a digital computer does. So Claude Shannon comes to MIT as a master's student and then later as a PhD student to work as an assistant in the analog computing lab under Vannevar Bush at MIT. And Shannon's main responsibility is working on the control box, the box of switches, the digital component of the analog computer that enables the analog computer to basically reconfigure the equations it's performing in the act of performing them. So rather than in the earlier models, you'd actually have to go in and take apart the computer every time you'd want it to act out a new equation and reassemble it. Over time, Bush and his assistants had developed a way of using switches to change the capacity of the machine as it's working. So Shannon is in particular in charge of this very sensitive piece of the machinery. But he begins to think of an analogy of his own between the switches that are directing this giant computing machine, the switches that go on, off, 1, 0, yes, no, the binary switches, and the binaries that happen in Boolean logic, the yeses and nos, 1s and 0s of Boolean logic. And the tremendous leap that he makes by combining these two very separate fields at the time, the field of mathematical logic and the field of switching or computing, is that you can use switches to act out any kind of logical statement you can represent in Boolean logic. And because Boolean logic can represent any kind of logical statement, Shannon has essentially proved in this tremendous master's thesis that you can use switches and connections that represent things like and or if or lights that light up to represent yes or no, your answers to these equations. You can use these basic components that anyone could rig up in a telephone system or a computer, very, very simple binary components to calculate the results of any kind of logical statement in ones and zeros. So Claude Shannon is essentially the person who shows down to the metal, as we say, that you can use switching, you can use a system of ones and zeros to imitate thought, to resolve logical equations. And that's the basis of all digital computing. And then the cool thing, the historical irony, is that he figures this out by working on an analog machine.
Right.
But he actually, in the process, makes an important contribution to making those kinds of machines obsolete over time.
You know, it's worth underlining that he does this on an analog machine. Anybody that's learned to program any language, it's all logic based, and that's the sort of mode that your brain has to get into. So the fact that he's the guy that puts this together, and everything has flown from that is like it's worth underlining that that's the basic wow that we're talking about here.
It's actually, there's a couple funny elements of it. One is he's only 21 years old when he makes this connection, which is just should make any one of us who have ever been graduate students really just sad about ourselves, right? I mean, this is someone called this the most important master's thesis ever written. It's also interesting because his later paper, the one he's really famous for, he's known as the father of information theory, and that paper was published in 1948. And there are a good many people who we've met who knew who Claude Shannon was, knew about the 1948 paper, and almost had sort of no idea or only a vague sense of this earlier work. And you just sort of have to pause and say to yourself, like, that's just incredible, given that all digital computing flows from this particular paper. It's also the same year that Alan Turing publishes his famous paper, and so that year is probably one of the most consequential in internet history.
The Vannevar Bush is sort of his mentor and sort of guides his early career, because he even he takes some time out to work on genetics, just as you do or whatever, but did he have an idea of what he wanted to do with his career, or was he sort of guided into various corners and then he sort of found his channel? And
yeah, he was, I would say, unclear about what he wanted to do with his career. And it's interesting because he doesn't have or wear any of the kind of overweening ambition of a lot of mathematicians of that era, right? The easiest contrast, I think, is somebody like John Nash. And he's a subject of A Beautiful Mind. And John Nash knew that he wanted to be a famous mathematician, right? And
well, like Nash is like also a guy that goes up to Einstein and introduces himself, versus, you know, Shannon is just occasionally waving at him across campus or whatever.
But it's interesting because Vannevar Bush is he's an important force in Shannon's life, because what he encourages Shannon to do is not over-specialize. What he encourages him to do is become a very good and capable generalist. And so one summer, while he's at MIT doing his graduate work, Van Bush sends Claude Shannon to Cold Spring Harbor, New York, to work on genetics. And like you said, it's just a complete non sequitur from the rest of his career. But he manages in a summer's time to write a paper that becomes the basis for his PhD thesis that's an algebra of genetics. Now, this isn't any kind of great breakthrough, and there's some debate about how valuable the paper actually was. But what it did show is that Shannon could be dropped into a completely unfamiliar field and use the tools that he has to make heads and tails of it and to potentially make some important contributions. The other thing that happens that summer is both Van Bush and his advisor at Cold Spring, a woman named Barbara Stoddard Burks, recognize that Shannon has unusual intellectual horsepower, that he's incredibly smart. Barbara writes to Van Bush saying, "To advise a youth like Shannon is difficult, is it not? Because people just don't know what to do with someone who is this brilliant." And there are signs of earlier intelligence, but this is his time at MIT is the first real crystallization of the fact that Claude Shannon isn't like everybody around him. To get back to your earlier question, he bounces around a bit. You know, he does his undergraduate work at the University of Michigan, sort of happens into a post at MIT that leads to the master's, that leads to the PhD, gets a fellowship at Princeton, which gets a bit diverted by the war, but he really doesn't have a sense that he's like on track to be X or on track to be Y. It's one of the parts of his story that we think is frankly most endearing. Like he's not careerist. He's not somebody who, you know, I'm going to publish this and publish that and publish that. If anything, he's the anti-careerist. He kind of floats and picks his problems and then lets the problems guide his career.
So Princeton, you know, at this time, as you say, the war is coming up and there's this flood of refugees, great minds from Europe that are literally seeking refuge from the Nazis, and Princeton sets up this great program, come here and do whatever you want to do. So he is at Princeton rubbing shoulders with literally Einstein and von Neumann and people like this, right? So tell me about Princeton into Bell Labs and things like that.
Yeah, so I'll tell you our favorite Einstein story. I'm really glad we got this in the book. We got it from two different sources, so it can go in the book. So Shannon is delivering a lecture at Princeton on some of his work, sort of, I think, the very early rudiments of what will become information theory. And about halfway through the lecture, Albert Einstein walks in the back door of the lecture hall, sits down for a second, he leans over to someone and whispers in the guy's ear, and then heads out the door again. And then immediately after, Shannon, of course, runs up to the back row and finds this guy that Einstein had spoken to and said, "Oh my God, what did Albert Einstein think about my lecture?" The guy said, "Well, he just wanted directions to the men's room." So, in the other version, Einstein was curious. He heard there were free cookies in one of the lecture halls, was out for the cookies.
Yeah.
So either way, it gets to the point that Shannon was put in this environment where he was rubbing shoulders with some intellectual greats of the era, but he never really connected with them. There are people also like Hermann Weyl who were there, and von Neumann, who would develop a more respectful relationship with Shannon later on. But at this time, none of these people took much of an interest other than the fact that he was on the staff there. And part of that, I think, was because these were some of the grand figures of European physics in the early to mid-20th century. And Shannon was just, as Jimmy had said earlier, he was much more of an engineering-oriented person, much more of a tinkerer who was interested in practical problems, which would prove to be really important, but at the same time didn't have the sort of intellectual prestige that some of these abstract mathematicians or people from the high school of European physics really cared about. So that meant that Shannon was a bit of an outlier in Princeton. Combined with this, he was also having a really difficult period in his life for other reasons. So for the most part, we think that Shannon had a lucky, fortunate, successful, happy life, except for this period, right around the beginning, the late 30s, 39, the U.S. entry into the war, in which a number of things converge to put him in a period of a bit of a funk or a depression even. One, he's not exactly sure where his work is going. Like I mentioned, he's having trouble finding patrons and support and interest in his work. Two, he has a first marriage that lasts for less than a year before it fails, to a woman named Norma Lavore, who is a wealthy person from New York, very interested in politics and literature and the Communist Party, and doesn't share a lot of Shannon's scientific interests. So it ended up being a difficult match and breaks up after less than a year. On top of that, Shannon can tell that the war is coming, and he's very afraid of being drafted. He said he's not a very physically courageous guy. He doesn't want to get sent over to Europe or the Pacific to get shot at, and he also doesn't think he could contribute that much by carrying a weapon that he could if he were able to contribute some of his math skills. So again, through his connections with people like Bush, and also some of his previous work being a summer intern at Bell Labs, he's able to get a posting essentially at Bell Labs working as a defense contractor and defense contract work, using his mathematical skills to solve some of these problems that the U.S. military was recruiting some of its best mathematical minds to work on. And these were not, I think, in the scope of things that the mathematicians had been working on. These were not the most challenging problems, but they're the problems that needed solving. So there are problems like fire control, or essentially how do you use probability and statistics to estimate the likely location of an aircraft, so that you can figure out the approximate location you should shoot at it at with an anti-aircraft gun. Or things like cryptography, which was a lot actually closer to Shannon's heart, because he had a lifelong interest in cracking codes and making codes and writing codes. So these things bring him into the orbit of Bell Labs, and they also help to put his life back on track in a way, because he has a more stable professional setting. He has a place that can support him in his more extracurricular interests. But again, the struggle at that point becomes the tension between the work that Shannon had to do, which was some of this defense contracting work for the war effort, which he knew was important and a contribution, but not exactly where his heart was all of the time, and the work that Shannon really wanted to do, which was the first inklings of his work towards a comprehensive theory of information. So the neat thing that we found in looking through the archives and Shannon's papers at the Library of Congress was the letter that he writes to Bush as he's leaving MIT, when he first says, "I'm beginning to get interested in the concept of intelligence," which was what people called information in those days, and the things that unite the properties of transmission of intelligence, from TVs to radios to telegraphy to cryptography. And these were areas that were entirely distinct until Shannon pointed out what they had in common. These were each an individual field of study that people would study in terms of their physical qualities. You know, a radio wave is a different physical quality than, say, the information embedded in your DNA, in your genetic code. But Shannon is the person who thinks about all these things in terms of their capacity to bear information. And he's putting the inklings together at Bell Labs, but the dilemma in his life is that he can't always get adequate time to work on it during his office hours. So he's really burning the candle at both ends during the war. He's working during the day on the war effort, and he's working on weekends and nights and evenings whenever he can, writing out scraps of what will become his magnum opus on information theory whenever he has a spare moment.
Yeah, I actually want to come back to that notion that he sort of comes up with information theory as a side gig, sort of. But we gotta hit the Turing story. I love the anecdote that the reason that the British send Turing to the U.S. is because they kind of don't think that we're smart enough to do the stuff with them that they need done. Yeah. So tell me about meeting Turing.
You know, it's an incredible story. There's a lot of mutual skepticism on both sides. The Americans don't think the Brits are handling the war effort well, and the Brits don't think the Americans are handling the war effort well. And one place of particular concern is phone calls, communication, transatlantic signals. How are the two sides communicating, and how will they prevent the Germans from listening in to those communications? And the Germans did successfully break comms between the U.S. and Great Britain and learned a fair amount of information. So Shannon actually works on a system called Sig Sally that is one of the systems used by FDR to communicate with Winston Churchill. And in the course of that, he comes into contact with a visiting Alan Turing. Turing is sent by the Brits essentially to kick the tires on this system and others. So he's traveling to laboratories around the United States for, I think, a 6-month period. And he actually gets stopped at immigration, and there's this big kerfuffle. He has to sort of wait until someone confirms that he's supposed to be there. There's all kinds of back and forth. He's pretty upset about it, but he finds his way to Bell Labs, and it's at Bell Labs, in one of those great moments of technological history, that Alan Turing and Claude Shannon become friends. They have tea. We found some accounts having tea every day in the Bell Labs cafeteria, talking to each other about everything that had nothing to do with their work, because they're actually working both on classified projects, so they're not allowed to talk about cryptography and code breaking, cryptographic analysis. But that frees them up to talk about all kinds of great stuff, like, can a computer be made to think? What is the nature of the mind? What is the nature of consciousness? Right? These are fantastic questions, and it's to people who nerd out on this stuff, it's pretty incredible to think about Alan Turing and Claude Shannon sitting there having tea, talking about things like early computing.
Well, and the beginnings of AI theory.
Yeah, and they end up actually. What's also interesting is neither of these guys are particularly, they're not social creatures. They're introverts. They enjoy their own company. They are social. I mean, Turing is so socially awkward. Shannon to some degree. But to think that these two kind of found each other is a really incredible thing. They actually we have a report that shows that Turing was one of the only people to visit Shannon at his home in the West Village. And so they're more than just sort of work buddies, they're hanging out. And it's kind of incredible to think about a time in New York when Turing and Shannon are out on the town. But they keep up the friendship, they stay in correspondence, they reconnect after the war effort, where Shannon and his wife are visiting England, and they go and visit Turing's home, and without missing a beat, Turing brings Shannon down to the basement, and they start playing on an early computer, and then sort of thinking about it and talking about it. And so it's an amazing moment in the history, and it's one that we were pretty astonished by. It's also what speaks to the kind of place Bell Laboratories was at that time. It was a significant defense contractor, a place that housed great minds, like Shannon, like Turing, and it's just one of those incredible moments in that story that was fun to research and more fun to write about.
Before we do come back to the big theory, the work that he does in cryptography, what's the importance of that generally to that field?
Well, to the field of cryptography, maybe not quite as much. Some people read Shannon's work, Mathematical Theory of Cryptography, after the war, and said it was sort of in the spirit of Shannon thinking, what can I do for the war effort that would look impressive? It comes out after the war is complete. And by comes out, I mean it was released into the depths of the intelligence bureaucracy, and maybe 5 people read it. But it was interesting theoretically. Apparently what Shannon does is he proves the existence of a theoretically unbreakable code using something called the one-time pad system. He didn't invent, but he proves that if you satisfy some very stringent conditions, you can have a code that is literally impossible to crack. But the more interesting connection is that by thinking about cryptography and thinking about the questions that cryptographers care about, redundancies in languages, character and word and letter frequencies, Shannon is also thinking about information. He says that there's a natural link between what it means to conceal a message and what it means to send a message. They're essentially converses of exactly the same process. So when someone asked him in a later interview, did your work on cryptography inspire your work on information theory or vice versa? He said, well, it was really just one big flow of ideas from one subject to the other. They were completely linked. So I think the import of his work on cryptography is not for any new codes that he developed, but for the fact that it got him thinking along the lines that would lead to a breakthrough in information theory. And I was just going to say, by the way, that again, his earlier breakthrough in Boolean logic and switching it came about because there were very few people who had toeholds in both fields. And again, there were very few people who had toeholds in the field of cryptography and the transmission of information. So the fact that Shannon could come up with these inventive, innovative, frankly odd connections between fields was one of the keys to his success as a thinker.
Well, and I was going to say, and in a similar vein, the work that he does, say, on the telephone networks about signal and noise and things like that, where, again, it's a practical problem, but then he's thinking about it in theoretical ways that it's all connected.
Absolutely. Yeah, he also, it's really interesting about the cryptography because he ends up becoming one of the people who's recognized around the world as one of the leading experts on cryptography. And that actually gets invited to advise the early NSA on how it's going to be built, what it's going to do. And it's, for anybody else, I think, getting invited by the nation's leading kind of defense and national security folks to come and join audiences in Washington, D.C., where you're meeting with generals and you're meeting with, the heads of departments, would be a pretty incredible moment. For Shannon, this is such a bore. He just doesn't want to do it. He's got all sorts of things that he wants to do. He tries to weasel his way out of going to these meetings in D.C., and finally Bell Laboratories just says, look, you've got to go. So he attends one meeting, does this song and dance, and then I think the record shows that he skipped a couple of other meetings. He only attended half a day. He would find ways to get out of it. And this just, again, speaks to the fact that this was somebody who was not driven to a career as a famous and illustrious scientist or scientific advisor. He was really looking for sort of curiosity for its own sake. The other lasting import, I think, of the cryptography paper is that there are some people in the cryptocurrency community who look up to and admire Shannon's work, because part of what they're trying to do is, in a way, build unbreakable codes, build unbreakable systems, and he does have one of the more important proofs in that space. So he's still there's still now a sort of renewed interest in his work there because of the cryptocurrency movement.
All right, so let's get to the chapter title you guys use is The Bomb. So as we said, he's working on what we now know as information theory almost in his spare time, almost as his hobby, although he wouldn't think of it that way because it's all tied together for him. But explain to me how after the war he's now able to focus on this more as his main intellectual pursuit.
Well, it's not so much that he's able to focus on it as main intellectual pursuit. What he does is over the course of 10 years, right, 10 years from 1938 to 1948, he is thinking about the fundamental properties of all kinds of communication. So, a simpler way to say that is what is common in someone's voice and in a snatch of Morse code and in a picture and in a song. What do those things share in common? And it was thought right up until Shannon that they shared nothing in common, that they were fundamentally different things. It was also thought that you couldn't find ways to encode, compress, and transmit those things, right? And what Shannon, over the course of 10 years, discovers is that no, there's actually fundamental properties that are similar. And he reduces all of those down to the unit that we know as the bit. Which actually, funny enough, he had called the binary digit. And then I think it was at a cafeteria conversation at Bell Labs that somebody said, well, you should just shorten it to the bit. So it's a unit of measurement and it's, it's something people can work with. But he doesn't actually work on information theory full time. What he does is publish in two parts a paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication in the Bell Systems Technical Journal. And so Bell Laboratories runs, among other things, its own academic journal. And so in the fall of 1948, unbeknownst to basically everyone, Claude Shannon drops this two-part paper, and part of the reason why we called the chapter The Bomb is because one of his colleagues said it came as a bomb, meaning he had spoken not a word of it to anyone. No one really knew that he was working on it. This was we like to think that Shannon's information theory paper is history's greatest side hustle. Like it's something he literally worked on that had no connection to his Bell Laboratories work, but he manages to come at the essence of information, and then, by the way, to show how you can compress, encode, and transmit it flawlessly over vast distances. It's at the time, even at the time, it's considered a breakthrough. Even its practical uses are not immediately apparent, but it's the kind of thing that even people reading it today recognize that the paper has an elegance about it, has a thought about it that was just leagues ahead of where anybody was.
Well, and at the time, people immediately recognize that it's really impressive too, even if it takes a while for the applications.
That was the that was the immediate reaction, was that we're not sure at what point we're going to be able to find the codes that Shannon proved must exist. But the very fact that he proved the existence of these codes that allowed the maximal compression and error-free transmission of information within these certain parameters, the fact that he proved they must be out there was just a stunning accomplishment. Another quotation we loved from another engineer said that Shannon's paper was like waking up one morning and finding marble on your doorstep. No one had really carved it yet, but the raw material was there and it was carved into place over the next several decades. So that was the challenge in the immediate aftermath of Shannon's paper, is what are we going to do with this, and is it possible to uncover and piece together these codes that Shannon proved must be out there? But the very fact that he had laid the foundation and had proved their existence was at the time recognized for the accomplishment that it was.
I saw a video of you guys at Google, and the interviewer tried to get you to like sum it up and give like an E equals MC square. I'm not going to do that because I don't think that that's, but if possible, could you explain on some sort of a layman way why that's so fundamental to modern digital telecommunications, everything?
I can take a crack at that.
Yeah.
We've been trying. So whenever anyone, in various ways, so I'll tell you what we've done after a year of talking about this paper. When we try to explain to people why Shannon's an important way, if they know nothing about him, I say, well, he invented the bit. He invented the basic unit of information. And he says a bit is essentially, it has to do with the probability of receiving a certain message. He says that information resolves our uncertainty. So information that, or a piece of information that resolves more uncertainty because it's chosen from a wider set of symbols, because its choice is kind of more random and resolves more noise, is the most informative kind of symbol you can send. So he says that one bit, a good way of understanding one bit, is thinking of a coin that's fair and has heads and tails. You flip that coin, it has a 50-50 chance of landing heads or tails, and that coin, before you flip it, in itself as a coin, carries one bit of information. It's a storage device for one bit. But the interesting thing, he says, is that as the coin gets more or less weighted towards one side or the other, as it becomes 60, 70, 80% likely to land on the head side, the informativeness of that coin decreases, simply because it's more certain that the coin is always going to land heads. So what information has to do with is the idea that the more random the outcome is, the more informative an information-bearing device or a message is. So why is that important? It's important because it helps us start thinking about the probabilities that certain messages are going to cohere with certain other messages. So this is an insight he gets from cryptography, is that symbols and words and letters we send to each other have a certain kind of pull on other symbols and letters or words. So think about an image, for instance. If you have static on your computer or TV screen, a white pixel is just as likely to appear next to a white pixel as it is next to a black pixel. The pixels are totally randomly distributed. And the interesting thing is, in Shannon's terms, that's the most informative picture you can get because it's totally random. And in our terms, it's not informative because it doesn't have a lot of meaning. But as that picture takes on meaning, as it becomes a picture of, say, Claude Shannon, white pixels are more likely to be found next to white pixels, and dark pixels are more likely to be found next to dark pixels. These pixels kind of have pull and stickiness. Or in written communication, some words are more likely to follow other words. So in Claude Shannon's favorite story growing up, The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe, it's the story of how a sort of amateur detective decodes a pirate's message and finds a hidden treasure. The letters TH are very likely to be followed by an E. You can, once you get the letters TH, you're very likely to figure out what symbol stands for E, because the is much more likely than any other combination of letters that follow after a TH. So by understanding these things, these redundancies and patterns that languages fall into, you can then start to manipulate them, and you can come up with codes for, on the one hand, compressing things, for taking out those things that are more likely to occur all the time because they're more predictable. On the other hand, for building in redundancy, for building in sorts of extra information that acts as a shield to your message. So the way Shannon proved that you can get theoretically flawless transmission or communication is, he says, you don't have to talk louder, you don't have to pump more information, or you don't have to pump more energy or strength or loudness into your signal. You have to talk smarter, you have to encode it better by building in sorts of extra bits to that message that can take damage in the course of being transmitted from one point to another point. And can protect your image from distortion in the process of transmission. So he says that it's actually possible to encode every message in such a way that it can get from point A to point B with 100% flawless accuracy below a certain speed limit transmission. And the speed limit that he says has to exist in any kind of transmission shortly after the publication of his paper gets named as the Shannon limit. And what he proves is that up to that Shannon limit, which differs depending on the kind of message you're sending and the medium you're sending across and so on, up to that limit, you can have 100% flawless, accurate communication. And that's the breakthrough that allows things like web video and the internet and email and being able to get directions to this studio on my iPhone. All these things are based on Shannon's insight that perfect transmission of information within those limits is possible. And that's the breakthrough that makes him so important to the world that we live in. And it all comes from breaking these things down and understanding a fundamental unit of information, which is the bit. And from that understanding of what actually information is, as the resolution of uncertainty, all these other things follow.
Well, and actually, 20 years later, when people like Bush are involved in the early ARPANET and things like that, they're literally building off of these ideas and putting them in place. The original ARPANET, those 4 nodes, are literally proving parts of these theories and things like that.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, I kind of want to elide over. Just give me two things: a sense of his personal life, because we talked about his brief first marriage, but then he does have a more successful second marriage. He has children and things like that. Just him as a guy.
Yeah, he marries, his first marriage ends in divorce. He moves to Bell Laboratories where he's working and meets Betty Moore, who is she's actually called a computer. That's her job title. She computes. Yes. And so she and others are referred to as computers. They do the computation for engineers at Bell Laboratories. He meets her. They very quickly fall in love. They bond over math, which she is very good at, and music, which they're both very talented at. And so this love affair happens. They get married very, very quickly, and eventually move out to Massachusetts, to MIT. After his information theory paper is published, he spends a few more years at Bell Laboratories, but then MIT comes calling and says, we'd love to have you as a tenured faculty member. So they start a family. They have 3 children, and their family life can only be characterized as sort of whimsical and mathematical. A couple of stories stuck out to us. One is that there were 5 Shannons, and they sat around, I think it was a pentagonal or hexagonal table. And the way that they decided who would do the dishes was a probability game. They would wind up a robotic mouse, put it in the middle of the table, and whichever edge that mouse happened to drop off of, that was the person who did the dishes that night. They had other just spontaneous moments of these sort of math moments, but it was a house that was really rich in music and mathematics, and it reflected their parents' passions. They all got into stock picking when the parents got excited about stocks. They used to have sessions where they'd all play musical instruments together. He had after his first marriage and after that depressive episode at Princeton, he has a life that was happy. It was rich. He wasn't a tortured genius.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
And he was really, it was one of these things that's like remarkable. Like we kind of expect our geniuses to have these like very, deep, dark past, but he really, really doesn't. He's they have a wonderful life in Massachusetts. He is a homebody. He's a very simple guy. He doesn't like travel. But his wife and his sister actually force him to go and accept honorary degrees and to travel the world. He collects awards for his entire life. Right. Some he decides are worth collecting. Some he just sort of ignores and leaves the envelopes where they are. For Shannon, his personal life overlaps with his professional life toward the later part of the 60s and 70s and 80s, because he becomes even more invested in tinkering, even more invested in building early computing machines, even more invested in questions of AI. Once he does the information theory paper, he doesn't really contribute to the information theory field that much.
Right.
But it's partly because he builds a 2-story toy shop and decides that he's going to build and invest in his time and energy in building various devices. But his personal life was very happy, and he, by all accounts, he was somebody who just always had a new enthusiasm that he was bringing into his life and connected with a lot of incredible people.
He taught at MIT the whole rest of his life?
Whole rest of his life, but taught is such a... I think that probably exaggerates a little bit of what he was doing. He received 2 he received a name chair at MIT. He was this kind of giant figure within American science, and people were expecting all kinds of great things of him. He arrives at MIT and realizes he's got no interest in being, being on the publisher Paris track. He's already got tenure, so he teaches and he does advise some graduate students, and we were lucky enough to talk to several of his graduate students. But he's not somebody who's like at MIT every day by 8 a.m. grinding away at research. He is much more interested in pursuing broad questions at this point in his career. But MIT is where he spends the remainder of his life, and they live in a house in Winchester, Massachusetts that was actually owned by Thomas Jefferson's great-granddaughter. It was modeled after Monticello, and it's the site of all for what I think is one of the great creative periods in his life. There are strict engineers and mathematicians who would sort of ask the question like, well, he just kind of hung up the jersey after the 1948 paper, what's the big deal? But the truth is, he builds devices that anticipate Deep Blue. He builds devices that anticipate the Apple Watch that you're wearing. Like he builds all these incredible contraptions. And yeah, they didn't appear in the pages of journals, but many of them are featured in museums around the world. And so I like to think of this period as very richly creative, even if it wasn't conventionally creative.
And Bell Labs kept an office for him also for the rest of his life?
They did, and I think they also kept him on the payroll.
Yeah.
Because as one person put it, it would be a shame for someone of Shannon's stature to be penniless. We must continue to keep him on the payroll. And they kept the plaque on the door and everything. And I think if you visit Bell Labs today, they still have his office preserved in that way because he was one of, if not the most famous alum. And they didn't want to lose their association with him. He did have a bit of tension in his life when he was thinking about whether to stay or go. But what he realized was that a practical laboratory like Bell Labs was going to start to look down on somebody who showed up late, played chess, used his spare time to unicycle in the hallways. I think he had realized he was overstaying his welcome, and that those kinds of work habits were better tolerated at a university.
We spoke a little bit about this off air, or we're starting to, but what do you think of Claude Shannon's either legacy, or is my perception wrong, or does he feel like less well known than a Turing or some of these other information founding fathers? I think
he is. I mean, he's certainly less well known than Turing and Einstein.
Turing has a more dramatic story to tell, so I get that, but. Again, maybe it's because this is what I focus on, but I was kind of surprised, like you guys said, like there had not been a book like this done on him.
Partially it's because I think he wouldn't have wanted a book like this done on him. He was, so in the 1950s, early 1950s, after the publication of the information theory in 1948, Shannon does become the sort of one of the faces of American science. Right. Yeah. He's given a profile, and he's put on a list of the America's most prominent scientists, which includes Watson and Crick and Richard Feynman and others. He is given a spread in Vogue magazine. He appears on television. He appears in promotional videos for Bell Labs. So he has his moment in the sun. What he does that's different than other people is he doesn't continue to ride that wave of fame and success. What he decides is he's just got other interests, and he wants to pursue his interests irrespective of how much fame or fortune they'll bring him. So in a way, part of the reason for Shannon's anonymity, relative anonymity, let's say, is that he would have preferred it this way. He wanted to continue to be able to do the things that interested him most. He wasn't interested in becoming famous. He became wealthy, but almost by accident, just being on the ground floor of a bunch of tech companies. He wasn't, somebody who went out and bought ostentatious things, houses, etc. He was somebody who preferred his kind of privacy in his private life. So part of the reason there's not a biography is just because, heck, it took us 3 years to get the Shannon family to start talking to us. And that was 3 years of patiently sending them information, making sure they knew we were, operating in good faith, that we were going to really do our research. It took that amount of time for us to finally get them to talk to us on the record. And so they like their father, just didn't, want to be, famous. It's also the case that this is a biography where the drama is in the discovery of ideas. There's not a lot of drama in Claude Shannon's life. There's no great, moment. And so when you don't have that, no one's writing newspaper stories about, the latest and greatest creation from Claude Shannon after a certain point in his life. We had to make We had to take what was available to us and turn those stories into dramatic stories of discovery, which they are. And so that's part of the reason why I think he isn't as well known as
at the risk of
others.
Putting in my own 2 cents here, but I mean, like when you read like histories of like the birth of the atomic bomb and things like that, like people at the time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s thought that like, well, this is where the future is going, and we'll have space exploration, and atomics will power everything and things like that. And the way that the modern world has actually turned out is that ideas like information theory have proven to be way more impactful in the modern world than atomics, and there's no flying cars, as Peter Thiel says, and things like that. And so it's sort of just this process of realizing that the things that, even if they were recognized, like Shannon's ideas were recognized, at the time in the 50s and 60s, they weren't recognized as, no, this is the stuff that is what the modern world is going to be built off more than physics and other. Not that they're not important.
Yeah.
That's just a theory that I'm...
Yeah, it's funny because I read an article about the 50th anniversary of 2001: A Space Odyssey a couple of weeks ago, which is just one of my all-time favorites. And one thing the person in the article was observing was that if you saw this movie 50 years ago, again, like you said, you thought the future was in expeditions to Jupiter. Well, it turns out the characters are also carrying around these little handheld computers.
Right.
It turns out the future was those little handheld computers.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if Kubrick and Clarke thought about it, but it was Shannon's advances that made it possible for those little handheld computers to do what they can do. And I think that's it's exciting. It's a little bit scary to think about that the course that scientific and technological progress takes is so difficult to anticipate beforehand. That's why it's exciting. That's why it's progress. That's why it's unpredictable. If we could predict it, it would have happened already. But the fact that the most influential thing to come out of that period, like you said, was not necessarily the atomic bomb, but it was Shannon's 2-part paper published in the Bell Systems Technical Journal in 1948. That, I think, speaks to what's going on now. It speaks to the fact that if you ask someone what is the most important work being done at the frontiers of biophysics or technology or computer science, it would be really hard to say. You probably couldn't say except in retrospect. I think that's exciting because it lends a degree of unpredictability to the future, but it's also a little bit scary because it's the same kind of unpredictability. It's the uncertainty of knowing where these things are going to be going. But it also speaks to the fact that someone like Shannon, who was able to have the free time to do innovative work, was able to bring together fields that people had not previously associated, was able to let his mind wander in a way that maybe some of his more literal-minded colleagues wouldn't. Those are the kind of people that, even if we can't predict what they're going to produce, tend to be the kind of people that produce the groundbreaking innovations. And I think there's something to be said in Shannon's life, not just for the stories of discovery and for the moments of his breakthroughs, but also for the kind of life in which those breakthroughs are more likely to occur.
Couple quick questions just about the process of this book. First of all, your previous book was on ancient Roman history. So how do you guys come to want to write a book about Claude Shannon?
Yeah, we read a really wonderful book called The Idea Factory, which was a narrative history of Bell Laboratories by John Gertner. It's a really wonderful book. And there are a number of figures. He traces the history of Bell Labs through the story of, I think, about 8 consequential figures. And one of those figures is Claude Shannon. And when you read it, you're just, at least we were, left wanting more. You're like, who is this guy who is a unicycler and a juggler and also, one of the 20th century's great mathematical theorists and also a stock picker and, so I just went out and looked for a biography. Candidly, I assumed there would be one. I went on Amazon assuming there would be one. And there were a couple of books kind of where Shannon's a figure connected to him.
Like The Information.
Yeah, The Information by James Gleick, which is a masterwork, right? But it's not a biography.
Yeah.
And there is something about scientific biography in particular where you see how the character of their work traces or has origins in some elements of their lives. And I always think there's value in understanding that, right? And so we pitched it, and Simon & Schuster liked the idea, and that's how it all came to be. But it was very organic in the sense that neither Rob nor I are mathematicians. We're not engineers. So when we were approaching this project, it was as beginners. It was as people who would have to sit down with mathematicians and engineers and have them explain things to us. We sent drafts of our chapters to the relevant people to make sure that we hadn't made any big errors. And I think not being experts helped us hopefully write a book that is accessible to everyone, because we do think that
it's extremely readable. Yes.
We think that there's value in having Claude Shannon be a name that's better known, and for people to understand how he lived and how he did his work.
Well, speaking of that, and he mentioned earlier about the family's cooperation. Tell me about that. What does his family think of his legacy and his fame, and maybe resurrecting both?
Well, I think they're tremendously proud of him. I mean, it's hard to have someone like Claude Shannon in your family tree and not be proud of him. I also think, like Jimmy said, that they are a private group of people. We spoke to his wife, Betty. Sadly, she passed away just before the book came out, but we were told that she was tickled by the idea of it. I don't think she had time to read it, but we were happy that we had a couple of interviews with her and got some quotes from her in the book. We also spoke with his daughter, Peggy, who was a great source of information for quotations for information about Shannon's family life and what he was like as a father and a husband. And of course, she went into academics herself, so he was a great inspiration for her career. Not in information theory, but also she became a scientist herself. And from Shannon's other son, Andrew, we had access to tremendous photographs of Shannon riding the unicycle around the home, or Shannon working in the toy shop, or Shannon as a young man with a bit of a kind of insouciant sort of smirk on his face, with the thought that he's come up with something, he's not going to tell you what it is. But you do get a sense of his personality and who he was and the quirks of his life just by seeing his face and how he posed and carried himself in different situations, and that was stuff we wouldn't have had access to if it wasn't for the family. So I think what we get from them is both the sense that his introversion and his desire for privacy and his desire not to make too big a deal of himself carried over into the way that they carry themselves. Not that they have anything to hide, just in the sense that they're not out seeking for attention and fame. But I think they were happy to see a biography that did him justice, that was respectful of what an influential and important figure he was in the history of technology, and that it speaks to the fact that I think they're, like I said, very, very proud of him, very proud of what he means to our world, and being able to combine that with a sort of humility that really characterized Claude Shannon.
Well, as I said in the intro that I haven't actually recorded yet, but the book is called A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age. I could not recommend it more highly for listeners of this show, because as we're saying, this is the whole world that we're living in now, and this is the guy that laid a lot of the foundations. But even if you're not super nerdy or don't feel that you are, it's very readable, and it's a fun story, even though, like we're saying, there's not the drama in some other stories. It's also a fascinating portrait of a great mind. So.
Well, we really appreciate that, and we hope people enjoy it and get in touch with us. It's been really great to also just connect with. Shannon had such a wide-ranging career, and so in the course of doing this work, Rob and I have spoken now to tinkerers, CEOs, mathematicians, people who we connected with somebody who spent a summer working as Shannon's toy shop assistant. Essentially, he was a friend of the family's, and Shannon hired him for a summer. So it's been really great to connect with readers who are just inspired by somebody who maintains that kind of amateur interest in so many different things. Because I think, we live in a world, I joked with Rob, I said, we live in a world in which, if I wanted to try to repair a car, I'd violate the warranty, right? If I tried to open up my iPhone, they wouldn't take it back, right? Shannon's world was very different, and I hope it's enjoyable for people to spend time in that kind of tinkering space for a little while, even if it's in book form.
Jimmy, Sony, Rob Goodman, thanks for coming on the show and sharing his life and also a great book.
Thanks so very much.
It's a pleasure.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.